The first question that I asked myself was, what is the origins of growth? What is its economic rationale? Is it something that has always been part and parcel of what we know as capitalism, right? Or does it have a date of origin, a date of birth, if you like, that one can trace to some of the problems that we're experiencing in the world today?
I'm Ranjor, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them.
Today I'm talking to Malcolm Ray. Malcolm is an author, journalist, activist, and academic, specializing in economic history. He is the author of the groundbreaking The Tyranny of Growth: Why Capitalism Has Triumphed in the West and Failed in Africa. The book provides a new lens to interpret and reimagine economics and its place in Africa and the world. Malcolm began his career in the Anti-Apartheid Movement during the 1980s and early 90s, where he developed a habit of independent but critical thinking. He has practiced journalism for more than a decade in the early 2000s before making his way into academia, eventually succumbing to the magnetic appeal of his first love, creative writing. We talked at the end of March 2022, and I've been sent Malcolm's book, The Tyranny of Growth, and found it striking and illuminating, particularly its look into the origin of the current growth dogma and the less than fully honest GDP model that we're all measuring our success by. I was gripped by Malcolm's life story and impressed by his knowledge. Malcolm's knowledge is encyclopedic, and he's clearly both very knowledgeable and very passionate about this topic. We actually got a lot more material than can fit in one episode, but I wanted to create this very focused episode because I think this is what's going to be most interesting to our listeners. We covered many topics, growing up and experiencing racism and severe exclusion under apartheid, how he became an activist fighting apartheid in South Africa, and later a journalist, the loss of his mother due to COVID and the economic context in which it happened, which provided a motivation for him to actually write this book. We talk about what's wrong with today's model of growth and the growth dogma, about lives versus livelihood, and how the current growth model benefits elites, but not the vast majority of people. We look at 80 plus years of growth doctrine and ask, where did it come from? And Malcolm goes into the historical origins of GDP and how the US essentially created GDP to justify the expenses of war and sell it to the American people in a less than honest way. And what GDP and growth dogma is doing to the poor and to developing nations around the world. We also talk about what gives him hope. Malcolm is one of these voices I wish many more people heard. Like a detective, he took the time to unpeel the growth doctrine and get to its rotten GDP core. And that really helps us understand what's wrong with GDP, why are economies becoming less and less equal. And essentially you get what you measure, right? And so this is a model that leaves so many so-called externalities out for no conceivable reason. So many things we care about are explicitly excluded from the calculation. This conversation is one of a dozen or so weekly conversations we already have lined up for you with thinkers, designers, makers, authors, activists, entrepreneurs, and impact investors who are working to change our world for the better. So follow this podcast on your favorite podcast app or head over to remakepod.org to subscribe. And now let's jump right in with Malcolm Ray. All right. I'm sitting here with Malcolm Ray. Malcolm, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you very much. And thanks for the opportunity to talk.
These days, we usually start with the COVID conversation, the COVID check-in, and I know that you have a specific tragedy that you experienced during COVID. So I just want to frame it as broadly as I can, but what was your COVID experience? What did you learn from it?
Yeah, the tragedy was the loss of my mother in August 2020, which you'll recall was the first year of the pandemic. And in around the world, and certainly in South Africa, where I live, we were in the midst of a succession of very hard lockdowns and a lot of uncertainty. But the fact that my mother was a casualty of the COVID pandemic made not just the pandemic, but the kind of economic circumstances within which the pandemic, became grafted. It made it especially, I guess, it made it especially acute for me. And that's not to mention the fact that the kind of social and economic circumstances in South Africa, as was the case in the rest of the African continent, were pretty dire. The kind of issues that my mother had to grapple with, things that I guess generally in the world, but especially in developing economies like South Africa, access to healthcare, access to care for the aged, access to social security. All of those things became more acute during the pandemic. And my mother was actually a casualty of that. She died and as much as I tried to help her, in penury and in solitude, which made this pandemic especially tragic for me. More generally, I guess, by the end of 2020, at the beginning of 2021, I began to look at questions, the kind of questions that I'm raising now, questions about the relationship between lives and livelihoods, right? Lives in relation to the pandemic and livelihoods in relation to people's ability, especially the vulnerable, the poor and the vulnerable, to manage things like hard lockdowns and so on. It's worse enough in normal circumstances. But for communities in South Africa, for example, living on the margins, whose livelihoods are literally dependent on trading fruit and vegetable and whatever foodstuff they can find on streets. For those people, it was really the difference between poverty and absolute poverty, right? So I began to look at the lives versus livelihoods dichotomy, which I saw as a false dichotomy. And I began to question the sort of link between those two things in relation to growth. If you recall, the typical argument was that economies that were in weaker positions in terms of their growth would find it especially difficult to handle the question of livelihoods. So in other words, if one assumes that economies grew at rates that were optimal, right, then we wouldn't be confronted with the kind of problems that governments were saying we were facing. And I felt that actually it was the other way around, that there was growth. It's just that it benefited elites. And I mean, I saw this quite clearly in the South African context, where the upper echelons of the middle classes and owners of capital didn't just manage to get through the pandemic, but actually made a meal of it. And in fact, not so long ago, there was some data that came out of Oxfam, which revealed that the 10 wealthiest men, and they were all men, in the world doubled their wealth over the past 2 years. And this related especially to platform corporations, the Amazons and so on of the world. And so, I mean, this was perverse in a sense. And so, the idea of writing something substantial that dealt not necessarily with the COVID pandemic and its consequences, but with the entire growth doctrine over the past, century, or to be precise, 80 plus years. I felt that it was timely to write a book of this nature. This is something that I could have written a decade and a half ago, right? It is something that crossed my mind a decade and a half ago. But as with most things in literature, timing is everything. And around that time, and this was during the first decade of the 2000s, I had developed an alternative metrics to measure the behavior of multinational corporations in the African continent. It was called Ethical Investor, but the thing is that there wasn't interest from anybody, least of all the multinational corporations doing business in Africa. There certainly wasn't interest from publishers. And I think what the pandemic did was it made people a great deal more aware and responsive to what people were starting to perceive as humanitarian crisis.
Yeah. This is a time where a lot of people are talking about impact investing. A lot of people who are sitting on a lot of money are now beginning to consider the effects of what they're going to invest in and wanting to divest from things that cause harm. In the last couple of years, that started to happen more and more. And so I like to take a step back, as we usually do, and see if we can connect and trace your journey leading to where we are today. And so what's something you learned in childhood or early in life that still drives you today or guides you today?
That's always a difficult question. I grew up in difficult circumstances, as did a lot of people in South Africa who were born during apartheid. So my typical story was working class community, a dad who loved playing saxophone but had to work in a factory in order to put some food on the table, and who had to deal with almost daily with the humiliation of the kind of psychological demolition and the economic consequences of exclusion during the apartheid period. So if there was anything that sparked or fired my imagination, and that in later years that invited or gave me a philosophical frame through which to rationalize a lot of the egregious consequences of apartheid, it probably was kind of the entire smudge of growing up in a context of profound exclusion, dehumanization, and so on. And I guess 13, 14 would be a turning point, because it was at that stage that I was introduced to reading alternative literature and philosophies of the world. At that early age, I became exposed to a lot of left-wing philosophy. I began to rationalize the anger that I'd felt over the years. I began to see that it wasn't just my circumstances or the circumstances of Black people generally in South Africa during apartheid, but the circumstances of millions of people around the world who, in different conditions, over periods of time, had to confront very similar challenges. And in fact, it was around that time that I became an activist. It was around that time that I decided that you had two choices during apartheid. You could choose to do nothing, in which case, in my opinion, you were almost partially complicit, or you could do something. The only real choice that one had was to take a side. And I know that sounds absurd, because in a sense, people excluded from an economy in a political system that I would call a racially exclusive democracy. In other words, a democracy only for English-speaking and Afrikaans-speaking white folk. It sounds a little insane to suggest that Black people had a choice and that there was a choice to take a side. But there was a choice. And many people who decided not to fight for liberation in South Africa actually became collaborators of the system of apartheid through the early stages of what became known as Black economic empowerment. In other words, the attempt by the apartheid government to co-opt a stratum of the Black community as a buffer class against the more kind of radical inclinations of an emerging generations of activists who wanted nothing less than the conquest of the apartheid system. I don't think that there was a single moment, is what I'm trying to say. I think it was a sequence of events from my early childhood until the cultivation of a kind of consciousness. And I don't think that I've ever stopped being an activist beyond apartheid. I merely migrated from one form of activism to another. So from social activism, grassroots activism, building organizations on the ground, etc. I think it morphed into writing. And these days I consider my writing a form of activism.
There's a story of injustice there and an intellectual framework to explain that injustice. And I'm curious if there was a clear sense of injustice before the ideas to explain it. You said 14, there was a change. So that the nature of that change, is that having the words to explain a sense of injustice, or is it really that there was no sense that there was an injustice, there's just the effects of it?
In my early childhood, the sense of injustice was always visceral. There was no way that at that early age that one could conceivably rationalize injustice. It was visceral, but I couldn't rationalize it. I obviously experienced exclusion. Things, very simple things like petty apartheid, which effectively meant that one wasn't allowed to visit certain movie theaters You were not allowed to visit certain parks. You were not allowed to visit certain beaches. Those sorts of things obviously occurred to me as a child. But as a child, you get on with being a child. So wherever that might be, you're going to be kicking a ball around with your friends. You're going to be trying to escape without even understanding what that means. You're going to create fictions in your head. You're going to imagine and mythologize. So, sort of the first 10 years of my life was visceral without rationalizing the world. And by the world, I mean the country that I lived in. Without even making sense of why it was that my father arrived home one day after playing a concert with his teeth kicked in. And the reason for that I later learned was because he had entered the dance hall through the front and riled a bunch of people who were the organizers of the event. For me, that didn't make sense. What made sense to me was that my father was wounded. So it took years of filtering out the background noise. It was really a challenge of, I guess, turning a kind of groping towards subversion into intellectual combat. And that's not an easy thing to do. There is no single set of ideas that I fully embraced. At various points in my teens, I embraced variants of Marxism. It was really a matter of moving through or journeying through the twists and turns of the 1980s and of exploring ideas through those twists and turns, of exploring notions of subversion, of exploring notions of organization and organized politics. It was made easy, I think, by the genocidal kind of logic of apartheid and the very peculiar version of capitalism in South Africa, which many of us call racial capitalism. It was a normal capitalism for white communities, but almost a primitive form of agrarianism for large swathes of the black community. So the kind of genocidal logic of the system didn't require a hell of a lot of grappling with ideas if you had an iota of progressivity in your blood. And I think by the sort of late 80s, I really believed, I genuinely felt that some variant of socialism was the only solution, the only conceivable solution to the resolution of the apartheid problem in South Africa. I really felt around that time that apartheid could not be conquered without conquering the kind of economic scaffolding of the system. I was wrong. The 1994 settlement in South Africa that ushered in democracy demonstrated that. You could get rid of apartheid and introduce some kind of variant of capitalism that included black people in it. That prefiguration, I didn't see coming.
And so you were involved with the fight, you're involved with the struggle, and then you became a journalist. And I heard you say that the first you entered journalism to be a propagandist for liberation, right? And how did it evolve from there? How did you find yourself within journalism?
During the 1980s, I started writing opinion pieces for various alternative newspapers in South Africa that had openly advocated alternatives to apartheid. And I started writing opinion pieces for many of these newspapers while an activist inside the trade union movement. And after the democratic settlement in 94, I actually left the trade union movement and became a journalist, proper, in the sense that I was actually employed by newspapers as a reporter. My journalism was different. My journalism was really about seeing the world through the eyes of communities and of articulating the impact of post-1994 policies on communities. So I would actually go into various communities and test the impact of the various policies that had been adopted by the post-apartheid government. Instead of picking up the phone and dialing a quote and getting quotations from policy experts, I would rather get the experiences of ordinary people in communities on the ground. So it was a form of developmental journalism that I practiced.
Yeah.
Much to the chagrin of many of my editors, who felt that their readers were far more interested in conventional journalism, straightforward reportage, opinion pieces that made sense to people who were, kind of privileged. By that time, by the way, the alternative media had collapsed. I mean, after apartheid fell, the funding also stopped. So the only option for progressive thinkers and activists like myself was, if you were going to practice journalism, was the mainstream media. And it was a mainstream media funded by big white capital in South Africa, in particular, many of the mining companies, the Anglo-American in particular, that owned the media stable. So it wasn't easy waging a battle of ideas within the established media. Very often I was waved off by my editors for challenging the official doctrine and so on. So the journalism I practiced evolved out of the apartheid period, from propaganda to exposing the limitations of the African National Congress policies through the experiences of Black communities on the ground, of poor communities. And then years later, when I became an editor, the battle wasn't necessarily with my editor. I was the editor. It was with board members, the owners of these publications. And you find that you spend more time sitting in board meetings, delivering reports on finances, on advertising revenue, on sales. And I think I realized in 2010, when I resigned from the last publication that I edited, that there was no way that I could navigate the vast chasm between free writing on the one side and being a glorified manager on the other side. That the only choice I really had was to leave journalism, right? And push the boundaries by writing on my own terms. And that meant writing literature. As precarious and as difficult as that is, it meant writing literature. If I was going to satisfy the kind of exacting muse inside me, then writing literature was the only option. And that's basically where I find myself today, an author.
You're listening to Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. If you're listening on a podcast app, you already know how to follow podcasts. So please follow this one. If you're listening in a browser, just go to remakepod.org to find links to all the major podcast players where you can follow our show. So you wrote in your book, and I'm talking about the Tyranny of Growth, you asked yourself the question of how did we end up where we are? So you write, it's 26 years after the end of apartheid, and I'm sitting in my study trying to understand why the vision I shared with so many other activists has become a nightmare of gaudy opulence and grinding poverty, of grand larceny and social exclusion. So you're sitting there in this future that was supposed to be better than it is. So if you have to put your finger on why didn't it work in South Africa, what would you today say is the reason?
When the negotiations between the Afrikaner National Party and the African National Congress began, many of us who were activists had suspected that there wasn't one form or the other a betrayal going on of the kind of spirit and ideals of the liberation struggle. And look, understandably, compromises are always made when you negotiate a transfer of power, as opposed to conquering power. And the ANC didn't conquer power. The African National Congress was, in one sense, a recipient of power that had been conferred, or partial power that had been conferred on it by the ruling Afrikaner bloc. Right. So there were compromises made. But in another sense, a lot of what had become the 1994 democratic settlements and eventually the new constitution of South Africa was actually embedded in the thinking of the African National Congress for decades. Right. So it didn't come as a surprise to people like me that some of the compromises that were made were compromises engineered, designed to cultivate a new Black elite in South Africa, right? I think for the ANC, it was a matter really of very quickly cultivating an elite class of Black people to legitimize the face of South African capitalism. Because its worst fear was that if it didn't do that, then people in Black townships, impoverished Black townships in South Africa, in rural areas, the vast swathe of the South African population, in other words, would very quickly move over to more radical alternatives, right? And the African National Congress was guided, in my opinion, essentially by the cultivation of a Black elite as quickly as possible. And the policy or the navigational tool that guided it through the first decade of democracy was something that came to be known as Black economic empowerment, and something which still exists today, which is the sort of organizing framework, economic framework, for recontouring, recalibrating, and recasting the capitalist system in South Africa from one that was racially exclusive to one that is more Black-centered. Okay, but that didn't come, unfortunately, without serious collateral consequences. The economic growth doctrine that the ruling African National Congress had adopted and its Black economic empowerment policies, at the end of the day, had enriched a handful of Black people and immiserized the vast majority of Black people. And so it had entrenched a kind of economic dualism in South Africa between extreme poverty on the one side and extreme wealth on the other side. So I saw a kind of a corporate hierarchy of power that had emerged, relatively deracialized, in the sense that you now had Black capitalists and an emerging stratum of reasonably wealthy Black people within the middle class, sharing the kind of privileges that historically white capital and white middle classes enjoyed. I quite frankly call that a conspiracy of elites. It's essentially nothing less than a conspiracy of elites against the majority of poor people in South Africa. And that's the situation we find ourselves in today, unashamedly and openly find ourselves in today, where the ANC, quite frankly, is nothing less than a party of elite interests, in the same way that Putin and the construction of an oligarchy in Russia, the same applies to South Africa. And I think what that's doing is it's progressively removing whatever moral high ground the ANC has had over the years. It has, in all but name, proclaimed itself a party of an elite in the business of nurturing a new oligarchy. And I think that poor people are starting to see this and are starting to make the connection between poverty and a bigger battle of ideas.
So one of the villains that you're identifying, and it's clear just from your title, is this obsession with growth. And so I'd like to maybe dive into that a little bit and understand what's the problem with growth. Is growth inherently bad?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's essentially the focal point of my book, The Tyranny of Growth. And maybe I should just preface my preoccupation with the growth doctrine rather than the system of capitalism. Why didn't I call it the tyranny of capitalism? I make the point in the book that the book is neither an anti-capitalist treatise nor, is it an advocacy of capitalism, right? It's a critique rather of the growth doctrine. And that's its scholarly ambition. I wanted to understand where it all began and how it came to be the kind of malignant system that it is today. The first question that I asked myself was, what is the origins of growth? What is its economic rationale? Is it something that has always been part and parcel of what we know as capitalism, right? Or does it have a date of origin, a date of birth, if you like, that one can trace to some of the problems that we're experiencing in the world today? So I proceeded to look at this, arguing that actually economies have grown. Growth has increased globally, just not for the poor. Okay, so inequality has sort of grown in tandem with growth. Okay, the second departure point in trying to understand the growth doctrine and its measure and goal, which is GDP, was to suggest that inequality is not a contradiction of capitalism. It's the norm, right? One of my key propositions was that nothing in the prevailing neoclassical growth doctrine makes redistribution and something like equality technically possible. And that the primary goal, right, of not just capital, but of the growth doctrine itself, the very notion of growth, is to maximize profit, not create employment and social welfare. I mean, this is not something new. I drew on some of the findings of Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. You know, one of the more popular references where Smith is concerned in The Wealth of Nations is that self-interest is what drives growth, right? And that in pursuing self-interest, individual actors pursue the interests of society as a whole. Now, nothing could be more fallacious than that. And in fact, if anything, what self-interest has done, what the pursuit of self-interest has done, and what growth has done, is it's externalized the stuff that matters to you and I. So it's externalized issues related to the environment, right? It's externalized issues related to social well-being. And there's a term, I mean, the term actually that is used by corporates and governments, corporates in relation to their own measure of growth, and governments in relation to gross domestic product. It's called externalities, right? Or negative externalities, which essentially is the stuff that's not included in how we measure prosperity. It's the social and environmental issues that are taken off your balance sheets, and that's not included in how we calculate gross domestic product. The other departure point for me was the kind of distinction between growth and capitalism as a system. And I think, you know, here there's a tendency, as I said earlier, to conflate the two. And what I wanted to demonstrate is that capitalism has been around for a few centuries. In fact, it predated the first industrial revolution, an early stage mercantile capitalism and so on. Prior to capitalism and agrarian societies, there was actually no concept of growth at all. In fact, in those societies, the only measure of a kingdom's growth was its conquest of land. And so your measure of your ability to wage war or to raise armies in order to wage war was the kind of productive outputs from agriculture or from agrarian production. And so your measure would be the weather and so on, right? It wasn't growth in the sense in which we understand it today. It was merely the conquest of land. When capitalism did emerge as a system of production, there was something like growth, right? In the sense that individual producers started to measure progress by their profit margins and by the extent to which they could repress wages. But there wasn't actually a formal definition of the economy or what we call growth, right? So I wanted for the average reader out there to distinguish growth as a goal and measure of all economic activities and capitalism as an economic system. And capitalism, you know, in short, has two defining characteristics that are unique to it. The first signifier is that it's a system based on private property relations and private capital accumulation. And the intersection of these markets with the second signifier of capitalism, which is profit, okay, the blind pursuit of profit. The trouble with both those signifiers is that hardly any wealth or any of the wealth that is generated in non-fungible form in financial markets is invested in socially impactful outcomes like education, healthcare, food production for everybody, right? Instead, there's a kind of what we've been seeing is an ideological disarticulation of growth from those things that matter. And here it's important to see how the growth externalities dichotomy is being rearticulated, it's being recontoured, and it's being harmonized in what I call a false dichotomy of what people are now calling inclusive growth. Now, I mean, you add a pronoun to growth, You call it inclusive, and you wonder why there's a need to actually have a pronoun. I mean, you put a pronoun in front of something, then there's a problem, right?
They should call what they're doing now exclusive growth, and then leave normal growth
exactly
to the inclusive one.
Exactly. And so there's a sort of what we're seeing happening here in relation to that is the inclusive growth phenomenon. The absurdity of it is we have a kind of emerging, a kind of totalizing meta narrative, right? To rationalize externalities, to rationalize the consequences of the growth doctrine. I think the last departure point for me in teasing out the growth doctrine was the limitation of most literature, unfortunately, that's come out of the West on growth. And that is that there's a Western bias to it. I wanted to fill the gap in the literature and look at the growth doctrine from an African perspective, to see how it became, or how it got to be midwifed into the African continent, and to tease out its social and economic consequences in the African context from an African perspective, right?
Yeah. Before we go there, because I think it's a really interesting next step, but I'd like to understand better this concept of externalities and how it came to be. Because when you're looking at a concept like GDP, it's supposed to measure how well your economy is doing, right? That's the pitch for why it exists. So how could anyone, how could they justify not looking at costs, right? Not looking at costs to labor, not looking at costs to the environment, not looking at costs to communities, all the stuff that, now fits under externalities. How could they justify it? What was the justification?
So that's a good question. And I think it's impossible to answer that question without looking at it historically. It's impossible to understand how they justify it today without understanding how it got to be jettisoned in the first place. And it's a long and convoluted story. What I want to do is maybe just tease out a little known byway in economic history so that people understand how this happened. The slippage that I'm talking about was around 1940 in the United States. Now, keep in mind that the US had emerged out of the 1929 Great Depression without having fully resolved the underlying problems there. It had commissioned a whole range of research studies and so on to investigate what happened, what went wrong, and how it could be avoided in the future. It never quite, other than the New Deal, it never quite came to grips with this. Now, as the sort of 1930s rolled on and the Second World War broke in 1939, the US, as you know, took a neutral stance, right? By 1940, the Roosevelt administration had already decided, well, Roosevelt himself actually had already decided that he was going to get America into the war, right? The question really was how to do that. There's two things he had to do. One is he had to convince Congress that the military-industrial complex, or the war economy, would not come at great cost to the economy. In fact, it would benefit the economy, right? And then he had to demonstrate to ordinary people out there that jobs would not be lost. In fact, there'd be net gains on employment, right? And the question really was how to do that. And he set up a unit which was something of a shadow government, if you like, led by economists and called the NDAC. And one of the economists in this unit was a fellow named Robert Nathan. Nathan was asked by Roosevelt to conduct a study that would set out to account for the costs of weapons manufacturing in the United States, and then graft something like a sort of Keynesian, following the economist John Maynard Keynes, Keynesian logic onto weapons manufacturing. And he argued that the greater the amount of capital the state invests in weapons manufacturing, the greater the level of employment. And in one sense, for a while, he was right, okay? But the consequence, the collateral consequence of that, following the Keynesian logic, was that social and environmental measures were kicked out of the measure of GDP by 1942. By 1943, the US had entered the war economy, right? And by that time, GDP had been formally adopted as the official measure and goal of growth, excluding social, and environmental issues. Through the so-called golden age of Keynesian economics from the Second World War until about 1972. But from 72 onward, the US started running up huge deficits. But it also started expanding its interests around the world. It was the start of US imperialism, essentially. And in expanding its interests around the world, the kind of genocidal logic of the exclusion of social and environmental issues from GDP made economic sense for the United States, certainly in continents like Africa and other developing regions of the world where the United States, instead of direct colonialism of the sort of former colonial powers, direct conquest, became something of a benevolent hegemon. In other words, its strategy was geared toward instrumentalizing multinational corporations to expand its interests. The unfortunate thing is that developing countries also, in a sense, normalized GDP. And so the book, in a sense, is a kind of narrative journey back in time to trace the complex origins of GDP growth and externalities. It was a lot like getting to the core of the onion and then delayering it, in order to figure out how it became the Frankenstein monster that that GDP growth has become today.
And you actually tell the stories, and it's lovely to see kind of the actual characters and the actual thinking of the people at the time. And really what you're doing is you're describing a tragedy on an epic scale, but you're also bringing us in the room with these people. It's a compelling narrative, and you can get sucked into it. And so I want to understand your thinking about how we should be measuring growth. And I know that there's been some different. So one simple answer is to just have a more honest accounting of everything, that's all the externalities and including them inside. There's the famous gross domestic happiness model from Bhutan, right? Throwing away the GDP model altogether. What do you see as are the most promising models for actually measuring correctly?
Yeah, so I should say at the outset that before I attempt an answer to the question, that the book, as large as it is, 500 plus pages, was really a diagnostic of the problem. So these are difficult questions. And I mean, there have been various attempts at including new measures in different metrics at sectoral level in the energy sector, for example, with the kind of emphasis today on non-fossil fuels, clean energy. There have been various research designs, that have tended toward an alternative metric in the energy space. There's been some work done on the financial services sector, precisely because it's the most volatile sector. A great deal of work has been invested in looking at how to reform the financial sector by including metrics that have as their center point employment multipliers and economic spillovers. There are different levels at which one can come at this. At a macro level, how to get the allocation of taxation rights, right, between incentives and disincentives. Right now, around the world, taxation is heavily weighted toward what governments perceive to be the most productive sectors of the economy, not the sectors that are the most humane, the most social, and the most environmentally literate. So in South Africa, for example, the most destructive sector, and a sector with a great deal of emotional baggage, is the mining sector, on which the system of apartheid actually originated, right? Of colonialism and apartheid originated. The bulk of the incentives are geared toward that sector, in spite of the fact that it's the biggest polluter, right? And the most unproductive insofar as wages are concerned, right? Or wage levels of workers are concerned. You've got this misallocation of incentives. A metric should be, it should actually have embedded in it incentives and disincentives. I think that's a very important point to note in designing metric, is what does it encourage and what does it discourage in terms of investment? right? And then I think in grappling with the question of a metric, we need to really come to terms with the fact that finance capital has got to be tamed. People generally, and certainly since 2007, since the global financial meltdown in 2007, people have been presenting arguments that have tended toward regulatory or market failure as the problem, and therefore regulatory or market solutions as the panacea. And I couldn't disagree more with all those assertions. I think that the crisis is systemic. And if we're going to design new metric, they've got to be designed to rein in capital, and finance capital in particular.
So we've heard everything that's dysfunctional about the system, and we've heard about the damages that it brings. What gives you hope at this moment?
I think people give me hope. I think the fact that people are starting to see a humanitarian crisis gives me hope. And I think that even though it's not a kind of activism in the sense in which we traditionally understand it in terms of organized politics, I think that a large number of people are willing to be heard who otherwise historically in the past may not have had a critique of the prevailing system, are now critical of it. So I think there's heightened consciousness and a consciousness of self that's starting to emerge among people who are more ecologically literate and socially literate today than they ever were. And granted, I mean, I think this has been brought on by extremities, by extreme social instability in the world, and by massive concerns about climate change. So, that gives me hope. I certainly don't think that the system is capable of recalibrating itself. So I don't think that the answer, or that if there's a glimmer of hope, that the answer lies in sitting back, using traditional monetary levers, now raising interest rates, now lowering interest rates to control money supply and stabilize currencies. I don't think the answer lies there. I think the answer lies, if there's hope, I think the answer lies in a new form of activism, where each one of us start to understand the problem in more holistic ways and start to exercise choices. Simple choices like what we produce and consume, what kind of enterprises we create. Are those enterprises socially sensitive and impactful? Are they environmentally sensitive and impactful? And the way in which we actually produce goods and services. And then from the consumer side, the choices we exercise in what we consume. Are we consuming products that are consequences of sweatshops? Are we consuming products that have in the background massive environmental degradation and waste? It might sound simplistic in a sense, but I think hope lies in the individual within a kind of broader social and environmental context, across demographies, across social divisions, certainly across countries, in some kind of global counter-narrative that I think is already emerging. It may not be a coherent narrative. It may not make perfect sense to all of us, but the rumblings of that counter-narrative are there. I mean, I'm testimony to that, and the fact that I actually chose to write this book at this point in time because I feel that the time is right.
Yeah. So this is my final question. In his TED Talk, philosopher Alain de Botton talks about the difference between a lecture and a sermon. A lecture being this kind of dry, informational, modern way of delivering information, and a sermon being an urgent plea to change someone's life. And he calls for more sermons in our lives. And so if you could give a short sermon to get something across that you think would really could change the world or could change someone's life, what would it be?
Wow, that's a tall order. A sermon. I think what's important to consider is that the world we live in today, first of all, has failed the majority of humanity. I think that's the first point that I would want to make. We're witnessing rising carbon emissions, rising temperatures, deforestation, rising unemployment and inequality, And wars like the ones that were, waged in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, various African countries over the years, and more recently the Ukraine, which is an ongoing tragedy. And beyond these wars are elites who, in their blind pursuit of profit, are engaged in either proxy wars or direct military incursions for territorial expansion, and ultimately resource capture. I would want to say that capitalism is based on a growth at all costs doctrine that can't be fixed. It can't be fixed. Pacts were signed between governments over the years to curb climate destruction, to build inclusive economy, to foster, economic inclusion, peace, and prosperity. Governments were given a chance to stop the carnage. They've demonstrated that the pursuit of profit is nothing but a mercenary endeavor. A tyranny of growth. It's a world in which we no longer produce goods and services to meet needs. We produce goods and services to make money for money's sake. We're measuring success using GDP as a metric by the money we have in our bank accounts, the value of the assets we own, fungible and non-fungible. To see a financial engineer earn more than a proper engineer, infinitely more skilled, should shock us, should shock our sensibilities. But yet we become immune to that absurdity. We're chasing money, we're consuming expensive brands at the cost of people, the cost of finite resources. So growth is tyrannical because it's driven by this sort of genocidal logic, a system designed actually to exclude everything that should matter from our balance sheets, from our national income estimates, about how we measure the things that should matter to us. And to give you a sense maybe of what I mean by this in the sermon, and I note this in the book, that if we add the social and environmental costs to GDP since the early 1980s, the real rate of growth is actually zero. That's the real rate of growth, is actually zero, right? And I mean, that's shocking, right? So I would want people to consider that we've lived in a growthless economy in real terms. An economy, a global economy that simply propped up a handful of super rich individuals who continue to amass vertiginous wealth. And it has repressed millions of poor, destitute people all over the world.
Thank you so much, Malcolm, for your time today.
Thank you.
All right, that's it for today. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to support it, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast app or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We run design sprints all over the world, and our goal is to improve outcomes, whether in business or various organizations, through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well, everyone. See you next week on Remake.